The 911 dispatcher froze mid-keystroke, her fingers hovering over the emergency console as the elderly woman's trembling voice crackled through the static. "There's a man with a gun at my door and he wants to kill my dog." Through the phone line came the sound of heavy pounding, followed by a low, protective growl that made the dispatcher's blood run cold, not from fear, but from the raw loyalty in that animal's voice. "Ma'am, step away from the animal immediately," the dispatcher urged, her training kicking in. "German shepherds are extremely dangerous when—" "Dangerous?" Dorothy Whitman's voice cut through like a blade, 72 years of school-teacher authority blazing through the fear. "This dog is standing between me and a madman, and you're worried about him?" The pounding intensified. A man's voice roared from outside. "Open this door, old woman! That monster belongs to me!" Atlas, 8 years old, battle-scarred and trembling, pressed his massive frame closer to Dot's frail legs, his scarred face turned toward the door like a shield made of fur and determination. "Why does everyone want this dog dead?" the dispatcher whispered, her finger hovering over the emergency alert button. Leave a like and share your thoughts in the comments along with the city you're watching from now. Let's continue with the story. 3 months earlier, Millbrook, Connecticut, had been the kind of place where neighbors still waved from their front porches, and the biggest controversy was whether the high school football team needed new uniforms. Nestled between rolling hills painted in autumn gold and crimson, this New England town of 8,000 souls prided itself on being America's Norman Rockwell painting come to life. Dorothy. Eleanor Whitman had called Maple Street home for 47 years, ever since Harold carried her over the threshold of the modest colonial house with the blue shutters and the ancient oak tree that dropped leaves like golden coins each October. At 72, Dot still maintained the posture of the elementary school teacher she'd been for 35 years, straight-backed, sharp-eyed, with silver hair pulled into a practical bun that hadn't changed style since 1975. The house felt enormous now. Harold's reading chair sat empty by the window, his coffee mug still in the kitchen cabinet exactly where he'd left it 5 years ago. Dot spoke to his photograph each morning over her single serving of oatmeal, updating him on the neighborhood gossip and the ache in her knees that predicted rain better than any weatherman. What she didn't tell Harold's gentle eyes was about the tiny white pills hidden in her jewelry box. Heart medication that cost more than her monthly grocery budget. Her son Tommy called every other Sunday from Boston, their conversations following the same script. "How are you feeling, Mom?" "Fine, dear." "You sure you don't want to think about Sunny Acres?" "I'm perfectly capable of taking care of myself, Thomas." The calls lasted exactly 12 minutes, timed by the kitchen clock Harold had given her for their 20th anniversary. On the other side of town, in the prestigious Elmwood neighborhood where houses came with circular driveways and 3-car garages, City Councilman Marcus Webb was preparing for another day of public service. At 45, Webb commanded respect wherever he went. Broad shoulders filling out his custom suits, graying temples lending him an air of distinguished authority. His constituents knew him as a man who got things done, who kept their community safe from the kind of problems that plagued bigger cities. What they didn't see was the basement of his Tudor-style mansion, where a chain-link kennel sat in the corner like a prison cell. Inside, Atlas lay motionless on a concrete floor, stained with things that didn't bear close examination. The German shepherd's once proud frame had withered to skin and bones, his black and tan coat dull and matted. Most striking was the jagged scar that ran diagonally across the left side of his face, a memento from the day he'd saved Marcus Webb's life and sealed his own fate. Atlas had been America's dog once, featured on magazine covers and evening news programs as the heroic canine who'd taken a knife meant for his handler. Now he was just another statistic in Marcus Webb's private war against his own conscience. a living reminder of failures too painful to face. Neither Dot nor Atlas knew their lives were about to collide in ways that would change everything. Dot Whitman had always been an early riser, a habit formed during decades of preparing lesson plans before dawn. This particular October morning, she stood at her kitchen window sipping lukewarm coffee from Harold's favorite mug, watching the sun paint Maple Street in shades of amber and rose. The familiar ritual usually brought her peace, but today something felt different, a wrongness that made her arthritic fingers tighten around the ceramic handle. The sounds had started 3 nights ago. Not the usual neighborhood symphony of garbage trucks and school buses, but something else entirely. Low whimpering that drifted through her bedroom window after midnight, followed by harsh voices and the metallic clang of something heavy hitting concrete. Dot had initially dismissed it as teenagers causing mischief, but the sounds came from the direction of Marcus Webb's house, and Marcus Webb was a city councilman who prided himself on maintaining order. As she watered the chrysanthemums Harold had planted in their final autumn together, Dot noticed Mrs. Chen from next door hanging laundry with unusual vigor, her movements sharp and agitated. When their eyes met across the fence, Mrs. Chen quickly looked away, her mouth set in a thin line of disapproval. "Morning, Eleanor," Dot called, using Mrs. Chen's American name. "Mrs. Whitman." The response was curt, formal. "You might want to keep your windows closed at night. That Webb man's got himself a dangerous animal. German Shepherd, big as a house. The kind that turns on people without warning." Dot frowned. She'd read about Marcus Webb in the local newspaper. Decorated police officer turned public servant, recently appointed to head the Public Safety Committee. The articles always mentioned his expertise with K-9 units, his commitment to protecting the community from dangerous elements. "I'm sure Officer Webb knows how to handle police dogs properly, Mrs." Chen's laugh was bitter. "Police dog? That thing hasn't seen the inside of a patrol car in years. Just sits chained up behind his house, getting meaner by the day. Mark my words, somebody's going to get hurt." The conversation haunted Dot through her morning routine. As she dusted Harold's photograph on the mantelpiece, she found herself studying his gentle smile, remembering his voice. "Dottie, you've got a gift for seeing what others miss. Trust your instincts." Her instincts were screaming now, louder than they had in years. That evening, after her usual dinner of soup and half a sandwich, Dot found herself drawn to the back fence that bordered the woods separating her property from the Elmwood neighborhood. The October air carried a chill that made her joints ache, but something stronger than discomfort pulled her forward. She grabbed Harold's old flashlight from the kitchen drawer and stepped into the gathering darkness. The sounds were clearer here, not the aggressive barking she'd expected, but something that made her heart clench with recognition. Soft whimpers, the kind a hurt child might make when trying not to cry. Following the beam of her flashlight through the thin line of trees, Dot emerged into Webb's meticulously landscaped backyard. What she saw there would stay with her for the rest of her life. In the far corner of the yard, barely visible behind an expensive garden shed, sat a chain-link kennel that belonged in a horror movie rather than a suburban paradise. Inside, a massive German Shepherd lay curled against the concrete floor, his body so still that for a terrifying moment Dot thought he might be dead. Then the flashlight beam caught his eyes. Amber orbs that reflected infinite sadness and a pain so deep it seemed to echo her own loneliness. The dog's condition was beyond heartbreaking. His ribs showed clearly through matted fur, and his water bowl sat empty and overturned. Most shocking of all was his face. A vicious scar ran from his left eye to his jaw, the kind of wound that spoke of violence rather than accident. Yet when he saw Dot, he didn't growl or bare his teeth. Instead, he lifted his massive head with what little strength he had and looked at her with an expression that seemed to say, "Please." "Oh, sweetheart," Dot whispered, her voice breaking. "What has he done to you?" The sound of a car door slamming made both woman and dog freeze. Heavy footsteps approached from the front of the house, accompanied by Marcus Webb's voice on his cell phone. "Don't care what the vet says. That animal is a liability. One more incident and I'm having it put down." Dot clicked off the flashlight and pressed herself against the shed, her heart hammering so loudly she was certain Webb would hear it. Through the darkness, she watched the councilman stride across his perfect lawn, his silhouette tall and imposing against the security lights. When he reached the kennel, his voice dropped to a harsh whisper that somehow carried more menace than shouting. "Still alive, I see. Don't get too comfortable, monster. Your time's running out." Dot barely slept that night. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw those amber eyes pleading through the darkness, saw the way the magnificent animal had tried to lift his head despite his obvious weakness. By dawn, she'd made a decision that would have terrified her cautious, rule-following younger self. She was going to help that dog, consequences be damned. Her first call was to Millbrook Animal Services, a conversation that left her frustrated and furious. The bored-sounding clerk on the other end listened with obvious disinterest as Dot described what she'd witnessed. "Ma'am, Councilman Webb is a respected member of our community and a former canine officer. I'm sure he knows how to properly care for police animals. Unless you have photographic evidence of abuse, there's really nothing we can do." "That dog is dying," Dot said, her teacher voice cutting through the bureaucratic nonsense. "Has the animal shown aggressive behavior toward you or other neighbors?" "Because if it's a public safety issue," Dot hung up, her hands shaking with rage. 47 years in this town, 35 years shaping young minds, and they wouldn't take her word over a man in a suit. She tried the state animal welfare hotline next, only to be told the same thing. Without concrete evidence, there was no basis for an investigation. That afternoon, armed with determination and Harold's old camera, Dot positioned herself at her bedroom window with a telephoto lens their son Tommy had given her for bird watching. The view of Webb's backyard was partially obscured by trees, but she could see enough. What she captured on film over the next 3 days made her physically ill. The dog, she'd started thinking of him as Atlas after reading about the mythological figure condemned to carry the weight of the world, was systematically starved and tormented. Webb would arrive home each evening and stand outside the kennel, sometimes throwing objects that made Atlas flinch and cower. The water bowl remained empty. Food, when it came at all, was scattered on the ground like scraps for vermin. But it was Atlas's behavior that broke Dot's heart most completely. Despite everything, he never showed aggression. When Webb approached, Atlas would press himself against the far corner of the kennel, trembling but never growling, never snapping. It was the behavior of an animal who had learned that submission was the only way to survive. On the 4th night, Dot couldn't stand it anymore. She waited until Webb's house went dark, then crept through the woods with a thermos of warm broth and a bowl of water. Atlas watched her approach with wary hope, his ears pricked forward despite his obvious fear. When she pushed the bowl through the chain link, he waited until she stepped back before approaching, as if asking permission. "It's okay, sweetheart," she whispered. "I'm going to help you." Atlas drank deeply, then looked up at her with an expression of such gratitude that Dot had to wipe tears from her eyes. When she extended her hand toward the fence, he slowly, carefully touched his nose to her fingers. The moment of connection was electric, two lonely souls recognizing each other across species and circumstance. The breakthrough came a week later when Rebecca Chen Morrison arrived in town. Unlike her conservative mother, Becca was a force of nature, a mixed-race animal rights activist with short-cropped hair and fierce determination. She'd driven down from Hartford after Dot's increasingly desperate emails, bringing with her both professional expertise and the kind of righteous anger that moves mountains. Jesus Christ, Becca breathed when she saw Dot's photographs. This isn't just neglect, it's systematic torture. How long has this been going on? Months, maybe years? Dot replied, her voice steady despite the tears threatening to fall. Mrs. Chen says he used to be beautiful, proud. Whatever Marcus Webb is doing to him, it's deliberate. Becca studied the photos with professional intensity, noting details Dot had missed. Look at his posture here. See how he's favoring his left side. And these injuries on his face. They're old but improperly healed. This dog has been through hell. That night, as thunder rolled across Millbrook's autumn sky, fate intervened in the form of a severe storm. Rain came down in torrents, turning the ground to mud and sending most residents indoors. But Atlas was still chained outside, his makeshift shelter no match for the driving rain and wind. Dot watched from her window in growing horror as the storm intensified. Lightning illuminated the backyard in stark flashes, showing Atlas huddled against the kennel's far corner, soaked and shivering. The chain that tethered him had somehow gotten wrapped around the kennel's support post, shortening his range of movement until he could barely stand. When a particularly violent gust of wind toppled a nearby tree branch, flooding the kennel's low-lying corner with muddy water, Dot saw Atlas struggling to keep his head above the rising water. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The dog was going to drown, chained and helpless, while she watched from her warm, dry house. "Harold," she whispered to the photograph on her nightstand, "forgive me for what I'm about to do." Grabbing a raincoat and bolt cutters from Harold's old tool shed, 72-year-old Dorothy Whitman stepped into the storm to commit what would technically be classified as theft, but what she knew in her heart was the most important act of her life. The storm that night was unlike anything Millbrook had seen in decades. Rain hammered against windows with the fury of a vengeful god, and wind howled through the streets like a living thing in pain. But nothing could have stopped Dorothy Whitman as she stumbled through the darkness toward Atlas, her arthritic hands gripping the bolt cutters with desperate determination. The kennel was a nightmare of mud and rising water. Atlas had managed to pull himself onto a small mound of debris, but even from 20 feet away, Dot could see he was losing the battle. His massive frame shook with exhaustion and cold, and every few seconds his head would dip toward the water before he'd jerk it up again, fighting unconsciousness with the last reserves of his strength. "I'm coming, sweetheart," Dot called out, though her words were swallowed by the storm. "Hold on just a little longer." The chain link was stronger than she'd expected, and the bolt cutters seemed impossibly heavy in her trembling hands. Each cut sent jarring vibrations up her arms, aggravating the arthritis that made her mornings a symphony of aches and pains. But every time she looked at Atlas, at the way he watched her with desperate hope in those amber eyes, she found strength she didn't know she possessed. When the fence finally gave way, Dot waded into the flooded kennel without hesitation. The muddy water soaked through her shoes and up her legs, shockingly cold and thick with debris. Atlas tried to stand when she reached him, but his legs buckled immediately. Up close, his condition was even more heartbreaking than the photographs had suggested. His ribs showed starkly through matted fur, and the scar on his face was infected, weeping a clear fluid that mixed with the rain. "Easy, boy," she whispered, the way she used to comfort her students when they scraped their knees at recess. "Let's get you somewhere safe." Atlas weighed at least 80 pounds, probably more in his healthy days, but starvation had reduced him to a shadow of his former self. Still, it took every ounce of Dot's strength to help him stand and guide him toward the gap in the fence. He leaned heavily against her, trusting her completely, despite having every reason to fear human contact. The journey to her house felt endless. Every few steps, Atlas would stumble, and Dot would have to pause to let him recover, her own heart hammering with exertion and fear. The rain continued to pour down, turning the world into a blur of gray and black, and more than once she worried they'd both collapse before reaching safety. But they made it. Harold's old garage had been converted into a workshop years ago, but it was dry and warm, with enough space for a large dog to rest comfortably. Dot led Atlas inside and watched him collapse onto a pile of old blankets she'd hastily arranged. He was unconscious before she could even close the door. Her hands shook as she dialed Becca's number, but the younger woman answered on the first ring, as if she'd been waiting for this exact call. "I have him," Dot said without preamble. "He's alive, but barely. Can you come?" Becca arrived within an hour, her own car sliding slightly on the muddy roads as she pulled into Dot's driveway. She took one look at Atlas and immediately went into professional mode, her trained hands moving gently over his body while she assessed the damage. Severe malnutrition, dehydration, multiple untreated infections, she muttered, more to herself than to Dot. "This scar looks like it's been festering for months. We need to get him to a veterinarian immediately." But finding veterinary care at midnight during a storm proved impossible. Dr. Elizabeth Hartwell, Millbrook's only large animal vet, refused to leave her house for what she called that dangerous animal. 2 emergency clinics in neighboring towns had similar responses when they learned Atlas was a German shepherd with a history of aggression, a reputation that seemed to have spread through the community despite having no basis in fact. "Then we'll have to do what we can ourselves," Becca said grimly. She'd brought a basic medical kit from her rescue organization, and while it wasn't adequate for Atlas's serious condition, it was better than nothing. They worked through the night by the light of Harold's old workshop lamps. Becca cleaned and dressed Atlas's infected wounds while Dot held his head, whispering gentle reassurances that seemed to penetrate even his unconscious state. When they tried to get him to drink, he managed only a few sips before exhaustion claimed him again. "Has he always been this size?" Becca asked as she worked. Dot shook her head. "Mrs. Chen showed me newspaper clippings from when he was still working. He was magnificent then, strong, proud, beautiful. Marcus Webb has done this to him deliberately." As dawn broke gray and watery over Millbrook, bringing an end to the storm but not to their crisis, Dot felt a familiar tightness in her chest. The stress and exertion of the night had taken their toll, and she discreetly reached for the heart medication hidden in her pocket. But when she tried to swallow the pill, her hands were shaking so badly that it fell to the concrete floor and rolled under a workbench. "Are you all right?" Becca asked, noticing Dot's pale complexion. "Fine, dear. Just tired." The lie came easily, a habit formed over years of hiding her declining health from Tommy and the neighbors who might use it as evidence that she couldn't live independently. But Atlas seemed to sense something was wrong. Even in his weakened state, he lifted his massive head and looked at Dot with concern, his amber eyes surprisingly alert. When she knelt beside him, he gently nudged her hand with his nose, a gesture so tender and understanding that it brought fresh tears to her eyes. By mid-morning, word of Atlas's rescue, or theft, depending on your perspective, had spread through Millbrook like wildfire. Marcus Webb arrived at Dot's house flanked by 2 police officers, his face a mask of righteous indignation that didn't quite hide the rage burning in his eyes. "Mrs. Whitman," Officer Brady said uncomfortably, "Councilman Webb has filed a theft report. We need to discuss the return of his property." "That dog is not property," Dot replied from her front porch, her voice carrying the authority of decades in the classroom. "He's a living creature who was being systematically tortured." Webb stepped forward, his voice carefully modulated for the gathering crowd of neighbors. "Mrs. Whitman, I understand you're concerned about animal welfare, but Rex, his name is Atlas, Dot interrupted, has serious behavioral issues. He's attacked before. Keeping him here puts the entire neighborhood at risk. But even as Webb spoke, several neighbors were peering around Dot into the garage, where Atlas lay quietly on his blankets, showing no signs of the aggression Webb described. Mrs. Morrison from down the street had brought her 9-year-old daughter Emma, and the little girl's eyes filled with tears when she saw the gentle giant's condition. "He doesn't look scary, Mommy," Emma whispered loud enough for everyone to hear. "He looks sad." The moment crystallized something in the community. Here was a decorated war hero, for the newspaper clippings Becca had researched showed that Atlas had indeed served with distinction, reduced to a shadow of his former self, while the man responsible stood before them in an expensive suit demanding his property back. "I'm calling Channel 8 News," announced Mrs. Patterson from across the street. "This story needs to be told." Webb's carefully constructed facade began to crack. "Now see here, you people don't understand the complexities of handling dangerous animals," but Dot had heard enough. Looking directly at Webb, she spoke with the quiet authority that had once managed roomfuls of unruly third-graders. "Councilman Webb, if Atlas is so dangerous, why hasn't he hurt me? I'm a 72-year-old woman who spent the night alone with him, and he's been nothing but gentle." The question hung in the morning air like a challenge, and for just a moment Marcus Webb's mask slipped entirely, revealing something cold and desperate underneath. The community center on Oak Street had never seen anything like it. What had started as a routine town meeting about the proposed dangerous dog ordinance had exploded into something resembling a trial, with Millbrook's 8,000 residents choosing sides in a battle that went far deeper than municipal law. The overflow crowd spilled into the hallway and out onto the front steps, where people pressed against windows to catch fragments of the heated debate inside. Marcus Webb stood at the podium, his usually commanding presence slightly diminished by the events of the past week. The story of Atlas's rescue had indeed made Channel 8 News, then Channel 12, and finally CNN, turning Millbrook into an unlikely battleground for animal rights and exposing Webb to scrutiny he'd never anticipated. "Ladies and gentlemen," Webb began, his voice carefully controlled, "we cannot let emotion cloud our judgment when it comes to public safety. German Shepherds are inherently aggressive animals, bred for warfare and police work. When they turn, and they always turn, innocent people get hurt." The PowerPoint presentation he'd prepared was professional and damning. Photos of dog attack victims, statistics about bite incidents, expert testimony from veterinarians about the unpredictability of traumatized animals. Each slide was designed to paint Atlas as a ticking time bomb, a threat to every child in Millbrook. "Mrs. Whitman means well," Webb continued, "but her misguided compassion has placed our entire community at risk. That animal attacked my previous canine partner. That's why it was retired from service. That's why it bears those scars." From her seat in the front row, Dot felt her chest tighten with more than just her heart condition. She'd spent the week researching Atlas's history, and Webb's version of events didn't match the newspaper archives she'd found in the library. But she was 72 years old, facing down a man with political power and police connections, and she could feel doubt creeping into the minds of her neighbors. Atlas waited in Becca's van outside, still too weak for public appearances, but strong enough now to lift his head when children pressed their faces against the windows to peek at him. Over the past week, he'd begun to show flashes of his former self. The intelligent, gentle giant who'd once been featured on magazine covers as America's bravest dog. The testimony against Webb began with Dr. Sarah Mitchell, a veterinary behaviorist who'd driven down from Boston after seeing the news coverage. She approached the microphone with the no-nonsense demeanor of someone who'd spent decades studying animal psychology. "I've examined this dog extensively," Dr. Mitchell began, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. The scarring pattern on his face is consistent with defensive wounds, not aggressive behavior. These are the injuries of an animal protecting himself or others, not attacking them. She clicked to her own presentation, showing detailed photographs of Atlas's scars alongside examples from her case files. Furthermore, this dog shows classic signs of complex PTSD. His behavior indicates systematic abuse over an extended period. No animal endures that level of trauma and emerges more aggressive. They become withdrawn, fearful, hypervigilant, exactly what we see here. The crowd stirred uneasily. Webb's narrative of an inherently dangerous animal was crumbling under scientific scrutiny, replaced by something far more disturbing: the systematic torture of a war hero. Emma Morrison, Becca's 9-year-old daughter, had been scheduled to speak, but when her turn came, she remained frozen in her seat. Emma rarely spoke in public. Her mild autism made crowds overwhelming, but she'd insisted on being there for Atlas. Now, facing a room full of staring adults, she couldn't find her voice. Dot rose from her seat and walked slowly to where Emma sat. Without a word, she took the little girl's hand and led her to the microphone, adjusting it down to child height. "Tell them about Atlas," Dot whispered encouragingly. Emma's voice was barely audible at first, but gradually gained strength as she spoke from the heart. "Atlas isn't scary. He's like me. People think he's dangerous because he's different, but he's just been hurt a lot. When I'm with him, I don't feel weird anymore. He understands what it's like when people are afraid of you for no reason." The simplicity and honesty of a child's perspective cut through the political rhetoric like a knife. Several people in the audience wiped their eyes, and even some of Webb's supporters looked uncomfortable. But Webb wasn't finished. As Emma returned to her seat, he reclaimed the podium with desperate authority. "With all due respect to Dr. Mitchell and young Emma, they haven't lived with this animal. They haven't seen what I've seen. You want proof of his dangerous nature? I'll give you proof." He pulled out his phone and began playing a video that made the crowd gasp. The footage showed Atlas in his kennel, appearing to lunge aggressively at the camera, snarling and showing his teeth. The timestamp showed it was recorded just 2 weeks ago. "This is what Mrs. Whitman rescued," Webb said grimly. "This is the animal she wants living next door to your children." The video was devastating. Even Dot felt her heart sink as she watched Atlas behaving in ways that contradicted everything she'd experienced with him. The dog in the video looked exactly like the dangerous predator Webb claimed he was. But Becca Chen Morrison had spent years investigating animal abuse cases, and something about the video bothered her. She raised her hand and approached the microphone. "Councilman Webb, could you play that video again, please?" Webb hesitated. "I think we've seen enough. Please, I noticed something important." Reluctantly, Webb replayed the footage. This time, Becca provided commentary. "Notice how Atlas is lunging toward the right side of the kennel, not at the camera. And listen carefully to the audio." As the crowd strained to hear, faint sounds became audible beneath Atlas's snarling, the high-pitched whimpering of another animal in distress. "That's not aggressive behavior," Becca explained. "That's protective behavior. He's trying to reach something or someone who needs help. Mr. Webb, what was Atlas trying to protect when you filmed this?" The question hung in the air like an accusation. Webb's face had gone pale, and for the first time since the meeting began, he seemed genuinely rattled. There was a raccoon that had gotten into the yard. A sick raccoon. Obviously, I had to put it down for public health reasons." But his explanation felt hollow, and several people in the crowd exchanged skeptical glances. The video that was supposed to damn Atlas had instead revealed something far more troubling about the man who'd been his keeper. As the evening wore on, more testimony emerged. Neighbors who'd heard strange sounds at night. A former police colleague who'd noticed changes in Webb's behavior after his previous canine partner died. a veterinary technician who'd refused to treat Atlas because of inconsistencies in his medical history. The vote, when it finally came, was closer than anyone expected. 127 in favor of the dangerous dog ordinance, 124 against. By 3 votes, Atlas was officially classified as a threat to public safety, subject to immediate removal from Millbrook or euthanasia. As the crowd began to disperse, many people avoided eye contact with Dot, shame and uncertainty written across their faces. They'd chosen fear over compassion, and everyone in the room knew it. Dot walked slowly to the parking lot, each step feeling like a small defeat. In 48 hours, Atlas would have to leave the only home where he'd found kindness, or face a death sentence for the crime of being inconvenient to a powerful man's narrative. Thanksgiving morning dawned gray and bitter, matching the despair that had settled over the Whitman house like a shroud. 48 hours had passed since the town vote, and Atlas was scheduled to be removed from Millbrook by sunset. No sanctuary would accept a dog labeled dangerous by municipal ordinance, and the state-approved facilities were essentially death row with a 30-day waiting period. Dot sat in Harold's old recliner, watching Atlas sleep fitfully on the living room rug. Even in unconsciousness, the great dog's legs twitched, and he made small whimpering sounds, as if reliving whatever horrors had shaped his broken psyche. She'd barely slept herself, spending the night alternately praying to a God who seemed to have stopped listening and composing mental letters to Harold that she'd never be able to send. The heart medication bottle sat empty on the coffee table beside her, the last pill consumed during yesterday's anxiety attack. Her chest felt tight and heavy, each breath requiring conscious effort. She should call Dr. Peterson for a refill, should probably be in the hospital given her symptoms. But what was the point? Without Atlas, this house would become a mausoleum again, and she wasn't sure she had the strength to endure that kind of loneliness twice. Tommy had called 3 times since Tuesday, each conversation following the same script. "Mom, please, be reasonable. Come to Boston for a few days. Let the authorities handle this situation appropriately." He meant well, but he'd never understood that appropriately and righteously weren't always the same thing. Harold would have understood. Harold had always been willing to fight for lost causes and broken things. The doorbell rang at 11 a.m., followed immediately by aggressive knocking that made Atlas scramble to his feet despite his weakness. Through the front window, Dot could see Marcus Webb flanked by 2 animal control officers and a sheriff's deputy. They'd come to claim their trophy, to remove the evidence of Webb's guilt before anyone else started asking uncomfortable questions. "Mrs. Whitman, we need to discuss the animal situation," Deputy Morrison called through the door. Dot recognized his voice. He was Emma's father, caught between his duty as a law enforcement officer and his daughter's passionate defense of Atlas. Dot opened the door but didn't invite them in. Atlas moved to her side, not aggressively but protectively, his massive frame positioned between her and the men on her porch. Even now, weakened and scarred, he looked every inch the decorated war hero he'd once been. "We're here to execute the municipal order," Webb said, his voice crisp with official authority. "The animal needs to come with us now." "His name is Atlas," Dot replied, the same correction she'd been making for weeks. "And he's done nothing wrong." Webb's patience was wearing thin. The media attention had damaged his political career, and rumors about his methods were spreading through the law enforcement community. He needed this situation resolved quickly and quietly. "Mrs. Whitman, you're prolonging the inevitable. This animal is suffering. The humane thing—" "Don't you dare lecture me about humanity," Dot interrupted, her teacher voice cutting through his political rhetoric. "You're the one who destroyed him." The standoff might have continued indefinitely if not for the sound of a car door slamming in the driveway. Tommy Whitman, Jr., emerged from a black sedan, his expensive overcoat and Boston bearing making him look like a visiting dignitary in small-town Connecticut. But his face was pale with exhaustion and something that might have been fear. "What's going on here?" he demanded, positioning himself between the officers and his mother. Webb stepped forward, recognizing an opportunity to appeal to legal authority. "Mr. Whitman, we're simply executing a lawful order. Your mother has been harboring a dangerous animal in violation of municipal code." Tommy studied the scene. His 72-year-old mother, pale and trembling but defiant, the massive German shepherd pressed against her legs, the array of officials who'd come to solve their problem with paperwork and procedure. For a moment, Dot saw echoes of the boy who'd once rescued injured birds and brought home stray cats despite Harold's allergies. "Mom," Tommy said quietly, "maybe it's time to let them—" He never finished the sentence. A sharp crack echoed from the kitchen, followed by the sound of breaking glass. One of the animal control officers had circled around to the back door, and his attempt at quiet entry had knocked over Harold's coffee pot. The crash triggered something primal in Atlas's damaged psyche. The dog's transformation was instantaneous and terrifying. Years of abuse had programmed him to expect violence from uniformed men, and the sound of breaking glass combined with the presence of multiple threats activated every survival instinct he possessed. He moved with surprising speed for an injured animal, positioning himself between the kitchen and Dot while releasing a series of warning barks that made everyone on the porch take involuntary steps backward. "You see?" Webb shouted over the noise, his voice triumphant. "Aggressive behavior. This is exactly what we warned you about." But Dot saw something different. Atlas wasn't attacking. He was protecting. His body language was defensive, not predatory, and despite his obvious agitation, he never left her side or made any move toward the officers. When she placed her hand on his head, he immediately began to calm, though his amber eyes remained fixed on the potential threats. "Easy, sweetheart," she whispered, and Atlas's tail gave a single, tentative wag. The moment of connection was broken by a new arrival. Becca Chen Morrison's van screeched into the driveway, followed by Dr. Mitchell's car and a Channel 8 news truck. Word of the confrontation had spread through social media, and Atlas's supporters were mobilizing for what might be their last stand. Emma Morrison leaped from her mother's van and ran toward the porch, ignoring the adults who tried to stop her. Atlas's demeanor changed immediately when he saw the little girl. His ears perked forward, his tail began to wag, and the aggressive posture melted into something gentle and welcoming. "Atlas!" Emma called, and the big dog managed what might have been his first genuine smile in years. But even this moment of joy was overshadowed by the crisis at hand. Deputy Morrison looked at his daughter's obvious affection for the dangerous animal, then at his duty to enforce the law, and seemed to age 10 years in as many seconds. The heart attack hit Dot without warning. The pain struck Dot like lightning, radiating from her chest down her left arm with an intensity that made her knees buckle. She grabbed at the porch railing, gasping for air that wouldn't come, and the world began to spin in sickening circles around her. Harold's face flashed before her eyes, not the peaceful photograph from the mantelpiece, but his vibrant, living smile from their wedding day 47 years ago. "Mom!" Tommy lunged forward as Dot collapsed, catching her before she hit the wooden porch boards. Her face had gone ashen, lips tinged with blue, and her breathing came in short, desperate gasps that terrified everyone present. Atlas reacted before any of the humans could process what was happening. The massive German shepherd moved with purpose and precision that spoke to years of emergency training, positioning himself protectively over Dot while releasing a series of sharp, rhythmic barks, the specific pattern canine units use to signal officer down or medical emergency. "Call 911!" Deputy Morrison shouted, his law enforcement training overriding the municipal politics that had brought them here. But even as he reached for his radio, Atlas was already demonstrating why he'd once been considered one of the finest service animals in the state. The dog gently but firmly nudged Tommy aside and began performing what could only be described as canine CPR. He placed his massive paws on Dot's chest with careful precision, applying rhythmic pressure while simultaneously barking in the specific cadence emergency responders would recognize. When Dot's breathing became even more labored, Atlas moved to her side and began licking her face and hands, a technique trained service dogs use to stimulate circulation and maintain consciousness in cardiac patients. "Jesus Christ," Webb whispered, his face pale with shock. "Where did he learn that?" Becca Chen Morrison was already on her phone with 911, but Dr. Mitchell had rushed to Dot's side with the medical bag she kept in her car. "He's maintaining her airway," she announced with professional amazement. "And look at his positioning. He's preventing shock by keeping her legs elevated. This dog has advanced medical training." The ambulance arrived within 8 minutes, but those 8 minutes revealed everything the town of Millbrook needed to know about Atlas's true nature. He worked alongside the paramedics as if he'd done it 1,000 times before, stepping back when they needed space but returning immediately to provide comfort and stability. When they loaded Dot onto the stretcher, Atlas tried to follow, whimpering when the ambulance doors closed between them. Tommy found himself in the surreal position of riding in an ambulance with his unconscious mother while a German shepherd he'd wanted removed from their lives had possibly saved her. The paramedic monitoring Dot's vital signs shook his head in amazement. "I've been doing this for 15 years and I've never seen anything like what that dog just did. Where did you say he came from?" "He's supposedly dangerous," Tommy replied numbly, watching his mother's pale face as oxygen flowed through the mask covering her nose and mouth. "The town voted to have him removed." The paramedic looked incredulous. "That dog just performed textbook emergency response. Better than some humans I've worked with." At Millbrook General Hospital, the emergency room erupted into controlled chaos as Dot was rushed into cardiac care. Tommy paced the waiting room while doctors worked to stabilize his mother, guilt and fear warring in his chest. He'd spent 2 years avoiding visits, making excuses about his busy Boston law practice, convincing himself that weekly phone calls were enough. Now she might die, and his last conversation with her had been an argument about a dog he'd never bothered to understand. Outside in the parking lot, Atlas maintained his vigil. Hospital policy strictly prohibited animals, but the German shepherd had positioned himself where he could see the emergency room entrance, and no amount of coaxing from Becca or the animal control officers could convince him to leave. When security guards approached, he didn't become aggressive. He simply lay down and refused to move, his amber eyes fixed on the building where Dot was fighting for her life. The media attention intensified throughout the afternoon. The story of a dangerous dog saving the woman who'd rescued him was irresistible to news outlets, and by evening satellite trucks lined the hospital parking lot. But the real drama was unfolding inside, where Tommy Whitman was about to receive information that would change everything. Dr. Elizabeth Peterson emerged from the cardiac unit, looking exhausted but cautiously optimistic. "Your mother's stable," she announced, and Tommy felt his knees go weak with relief. "But Mr. Whitman, we need to talk about her medical history." They sat in a small consultation room while Dr. Peterson reviewed Dot's chart. "Did you know your mother has been managing severe cardiac arrhythmia for at least 2 years? The medication levels in her blood indicate she's been taking prescription heart medication, but there's no record of her being treated by any physician in this area." Tommy stared at the medical records in confusion. "That's impossible." "She would have told me if she was sick." The prescription bottles we found in her purse are from a pharmacy in Hartford. She's been driving 90 minutes each way to fill prescriptions and see a cardiologist, paying cash so the visits wouldn't appear on local medical records. Mr. Whitman, your mother has been hiding a serious heart condition because she was afraid. Afraid of what? Dr. Peterson's expression was gentle but direct. According to her medical history, she was terrified that if you knew about her heart problems, you'd insist on moving her to assisted living. She was willing to risk her life to maintain her independence. The revelation hit Tommy like a physical blow. His mother, his strong, stubborn, fiercely independent mother, had been slowly dying while hiding her condition to avoid burdening him, and in her isolation and fear, she'd found purpose and companionship in a dog he'd dismissed as a dangerous nuisance. As if summoned by his thoughts, Atlas appeared in the hallway outside the consultation room. Somehow, the determined German shepherd had made it past security, past nurses, past hospital administrators, and was now sitting patiently beside the door, where Tommy wrestled with his guilt and grief. "How did he get in here?" Dr. Peterson asked in amazement. A nurse appeared, looking flustered and apologetic. "I'm sorry, doctor. He just walked in through the emergency entrance like he belonged here. When we tried to stop him, he showed us this." She held up a service dog vest that Becca must have put on Atlas, not an official designation, but enough to give the hospital staff pause. More importantly, Atlas was displaying the calm, purposeful demeanor of a working animal, not the chaotic energy of a pet or stray. "He's been sitting outside your mother's room for the past hour," the nurse continued. "The cardiac patients are actually responding well to his presence, Mrs. Chen asked if he could stay. She says he reminds her of her late husband's therapy dog." Tommy looked through the consultation room's window at Atlas, who returned his gaze with patient intelligence. This was the same animal he'd wanted removed from his mother's life, the dangerous creature that had just saved her when he hadn't even known she was in danger. "Can I see her now?" Tommy asked. Dot was awake when he entered her room, though she looked fragile and small against the hospital bed's white sheets. An IV drip fed medication into her arm, and monitors tracked her heart rhythm with electronic beeps that seemed both reassuring and ominous. "Tommy," she whispered, her voice hoarse from the oxygen tube. "Atlas, is he—" "He's fine, Mom. He's right outside." Tommy pulled a chair close to her bed, noting how her eyes immediately searched for the dog she couldn't see. "Mom, why didn't you tell me about your heart?" Dot's laugh was weak but held echoes of her old spirit. "Because you'd have bundled me off to some sterile facility where they'd keep me safe and comfortable until I died of boredom. I've been taking care of myself for 72 years, Thomas. I didn't plan to stop now. But you could have died. You almost did die. And if I had, it would have been in my own home, fighting for something I believed in, instead of wasting away in some institutional corridor." Her voice grew stronger as she spoke, the fierce independence that had shaped her entire life blazing through her illness. "That dog gave me a reason to get up in the morning, Tommy. He needed me, and I needed to be needed." Through the window, Tommy could see Atlas maintaining his patient watch in the hallway, occasionally visited by hospital staff who'd heard about his heroic actions. The monster that had supposedly threatened Millbrook's children was now serving as an unofficial therapy animal for cardiac patients. "The town voted to have him removed," Tommy said quietly. Dot's expression hardened. "Then the town was wrong. Sometimes good people make bad decisions when they're afraid, but that doesn't make the decisions right." A commotion in the hallway interrupted their conversation. Raised voices, the sound of rapid footsteps, and then Becca Chen Morrison appeared in the doorway, her face flushed with excitement and determination. "Mrs. Whitman, Tommy, you need to see this. We found something that changes everything." She held up a small digital camera, its screen displaying a video that would expose the truth about Marcus Webb and vindicate Atlas in ways none of them had dared to hope. The investigation that had begun with a 72-year-old woman's moral courage was about to reveal secrets that would shake Millbrook to its foundations. The video was grainy, shot through a chain-link fence by an automatic security camera that Webb hadn't known existed, but the footage was clear enough to destroy everything Marcus Webb had built his reputation on, and damning enough to vindicate Atlas in the most profound way possible. "This came from the Hendersons' backyard security system," Becca explained breathlessly, adjusting the camera's small screen so both Tommy and Dot could see. "Their property backs up to Webb's, and they've had surveillance cameras running for 6 months because of break-ins. When I told them what we suspected, Mrs. Henderson checked their archives." The timestamp read, 18 months ago. On screen, a younger, healthier Atlas could be seen in Webb's backyard, still bearing his facial scar but moving with the confidence and grace of a working dog. He was actually playing, with another German Shepherd, a smaller male with the distinctive tan and black markings of police K9 breeding. "That's Rex," Tommy whispered, recognizing the dog from newspaper clippings about Webb's distinguished K9 career. "But I thought Rex died in the line of duty." "Watch," Becca said grimly. The footage showed Webb emerging from his house, clearly intoxicated, stumbling slightly as he approached the two dogs. His voice carried across the backyard, slurred with alcohol and rage. "Fucking useless animals! Should have listened, should have followed orders." What happened next was difficult to watch. Webb began screaming at Rex, who cowered immediately, recognizing the signs of his handler's dangerous moods. But when Webb raised his hand to strike the smaller dog, Atlas intervened, positioning his larger body between Webb and Rex with the protective instincts that had made him a decorated service animal. The confrontation escalated quickly. Webb, in his drunken fury, grabbed a metal rake from his garden shed and began swinging it at both dogs. Rex, trained to obey his handler even in the face of abuse, tried to submit by lying down and exposing his throat. But Atlas continued to shield the smaller dog, taking blow after blow while maintaining his protective stance. Then came the moment that explained everything. Atlas's scarred face, Rex's mysterious line-of-duty death, and Webb's subsequent obsession with destroying the witness to his crime. Webb's final blow with the rake caught Rex directly in the skull. The smaller dog collapsed instantly, blood pooling beneath his head as his body convulsed once and went still. Atlas immediately went to his fallen companion, nudging him gently, whimpering in distress when Rex didn't respond. But Webb wasn't finished. Enraged by what he'd done and terrified of the consequences, he turned on Atlas with renewed violence. The rake's metal tines caught the larger dog across the face, opening the wound that would become his permanent scar. Atlas could have easily overpowered the intoxicated man, could have fought back with lethal force. Instead, he retreated to the far corner of the yard, bleeding and traumatized but refusing to retaliate against a human being. The final minutes of the footage showed Webb dragging Rex's body into his garage while Atlas watched in silent witness, the only creature alive who knew the truth about what had really happened that night. "He killed his own partner," Dot whispered, her voice heavy with horror and understanding. "And Atlas saw everything." Becca nodded. Rex was reported as killed in action 3 days later. Webb claimed they were pursuing a suspect when Rex was struck by a car. But the coroner's report shows injuries consistent with blunt force trauma from a metal object, not vehicular impact. Webb used his position and reputation to cover up the murder. Tommy stared at the camera screen, pieces of a horrific puzzle falling into place. That's why Webb wanted Atlas destroyed, not because he was dangerous, but because he was the only witness. And why Atlas has PTSD around men in uniform, Dot added, her heart breaking for the gentle giant who'd endured 2 years of systematic abuse designed to either break his spirit completely or provoke him into the kind of aggressive behavior that would justify his execution. Marcus Webb has been trying to murder the only witness to his crime. The implications were staggering. Webb hadn't just abused an animal. He'd committed murder, falsified official reports, and used his political position to orchestrate a cover-up that had nearly succeeded. The dangerous dog ordinance had been crafted specifically to provide legal justification for silencing Atlas permanently. "We have to get this to the authorities immediately," Tommy said, but Becca was already ahead of him. "I've been on the phone with State Police Detective Maria Santos for the past hour. She's driving down from Hartford with a warrant for Webb's arrest. But Tommy, there's something else you need to know." She pulled up a second video file, this one more recent. This footage is from last week, the day after the town vote. Webb didn't know the Hendersons' cameras were still running. This video showed a very different scene. Webb in his backyard with 2 other men, their faces partially obscured but their intent unmistakable. They were discussing disposal methods and making it look accidental, planning Atlas's death with the cold calculation of experienced killers. The man on the left is Tony Marcelli, Webb's cousin. He runs a disposal business, Becca explained delicately. The other one is someone called Frank. Based on their conversation, they were planning to break into your house tonight, kill Atlas, and make it look like he attacked an intruder. The revelation sent ice through Tommy's veins. His mother hadn't just been housing a traumatized animal. She'd been protecting a witness while unknowingly harboring a target for assassination. Her heart attack might have saved both their lives by bringing the situation into public view. "Where's Webb now?" he asked. "That's the problem. He disappeared 6 hours ago. State police have an APB out, but he could be anywhere. Santos thinks he might try one last attempt to silence Atlas before fleeing the jurisdiction." As if summoned by the mention of his name, Atlas appeared in the hospital room doorway. The massive German shepherd moved carefully around the medical equipment, his amber eyes fixed on Dot with an expression of pure devotion. When he reached her bedside, he gently placed his scarred muzzle on her hand, as if reassuring himself that she was real and alive. "Hello, sweetheart," Dot whispered, stroking his head with fingers that still trembled from her cardiac episode. "I'm sorry you've been waiting alone." Atlas settled beside her bed with a deep sigh, the kind of sound a creature makes when it finally finds safety after years of fear. For the first time since Becca had met him, the dog looked truly at peace. "Mrs. Whitman," Becca said softly, "Detective Santos wants to put Atlas in protective custody until Webb is apprehended, given what we know about his plans." "Absolutely not." Dot's voice carried the authority of decades in the classroom. "That dog has spent enough time in cages. He stays with family." Tommy looked at his mother, frail and determined in her hospital bed, and at Atlas, whose gentle presence had somehow become the center of their rebuilt relationship. 6 months ago, he'd been a successful but emotionally distant lawyer who called his mother twice a month out of duty. Now he was part of something larger, a family that included a scarred war hero who'd saved them all in ways they were only beginning to understand. "Then we stay together," Tommy said firmly. "All of us. Whatever happens next, we face it as a family." Outside, Detective Santos was arriving with backup units and arrest warrants. Marcus Webb's carefully constructed world was about to collapse completely, but the greatest victory belonged to a gentle giant who'd endured 2 years of hell without losing his capacity for love. Atlas had won more than his freedom. He'd found his forever home. 6 months later, on a perfect Memorial Day morning in Millbrook, Connecticut, the annual ceremony at Veterans Memorial Park carried special significance. The American flags snapped proudly in the gentle breeze, and families gathered on the freshly mowed grass to honor those who had served and sacrificed. But this year, there was an addition to the traditional proceedings that would have made Harold Whitman's heart swell with pride. Dorothy Whitman, now 73 and moving carefully but steadily with her new cardiac pacemaker, stood beside the memorial wall where Harold's name was etched in black granite. Beside her, Atlas sat at perfect attention, wearing a special service vest that read, "Therapy Dog, Millbrook General Hospital." The scar that ran across his face had become something beautiful in the months since Webb's arrest. Not a mark of shame, but a badge of honor that reminded everyone of his courage and resilience. Tommy had moved back to Connecticut permanently, establishing a small practice that specialized in animal rights law. The transition from high-powered Boston attorney to small-town advocate had surprised his former colleagues, but it had given him something he'd never found in corporate law: purpose that aligned with his values. More importantly, it had given him back his relationship with his mother. "You know, Harold," Dot said softly to the memorial stone, "I think you'd approve of how things turned out. Tommy's home, Atlas, has become quite the celebrity, and this old house feels like a real home again." Atlas had indeed become Millbrook's most famous resident. The story of his rescue and Marcus Webb's spectacular downfall had made national news, transforming the German Shepherd from a feared monster into a symbol of hope and redemption. But more practically, he'd found his calling as a therapy dog at the hospital where Dot had nearly died. Dr. Peterson had been the first to notice Atlas's remarkable ability to sense cardiac distress in patients. During his unofficial visits to see Dot during her recovery, he'd consistently positioned himself near patients who were experiencing heart problems, often alerting nurses to issues before monitoring equipment detected them. What had started as coincidence was eventually recognized as extraordinary intuitive ability, leading to his formal certification as a medical alert dog. "Mrs. Morrison's grandson had another episode last week," Dot continued her one-sided conversation with Harold's memorial. "Atlas sensed it 30 minutes before the monitor showed any irregularity, gave the doctors time to adjust his medication and prevent a full cardiac event." Emma Morrison, now 10 years old and Atlas's most devoted friend, had blossomed under the dog's patient companionship. Her mild autism, which had once made social situations overwhelming, became manageable when Atlas was nearby. The big dog seemed to understand her need for quiet support and predictable routine, providing both without judgment or demands. The Memorial Day ceremony began with the traditional laying of wreaths, but this year included a special presentation. Mayor Davidson, who had replaced the disgraced Marcus Webb after his conviction on charges of animal cruelty, evidence tampering, and the murder of his canine partner Rex, approached the podium with obvious emotion. "Today we honor not just our human veterans, but a four-legged hero who exemplifies the very best of service and sacrifice," Mayor Davidson announced. "Atlas served with distinction as a canine officer, survived terrible abuse, and continues to serve our community as a therapy dog at Millbrook General Hospital." The crowd applauded as Becca Chen Morrison, now serving as the town's Director of Animal Welfare, led Atlas to the front of the gathering. The transformation in the dog over the past 6 months was remarkable. His coat had regained its lustrous black and tan coloring. His weight had returned to a healthy 85 pounds, and most importantly, his eyes held the calm confidence of an animal who knew he was loved and valued. "Atlas represents what we can accomplish when we choose compassion over fear," Mayor Davidson continued. "His story reminds us that healing is possible, that second chances matter, and that sometimes the most broken among us have the most to offer." As if understanding the solemnity of the moment, Atlas maintained perfect military bearing throughout the ceremony. When the bugler played taps, he sat motionless, his amber eyes fixed on the memorial wall where Harold's name was inscribed alongside dozens of other local heroes. After the ceremony, families scattered across the park for picnics and informal gatherings. The Whitman family, Dot, Tommy, and Atlas, had claimed a spot under Harold's favorite oak tree, the same one where he'd proposed to Dot 50 years earlier. Emma Morrison and her parents joined them, as had become tradition for holiday gatherings. "Tell us the story again, Grandma Dot," Emma requested, using the honorary title she'd bestowed on Dot months earlier. "About how you and Atlas found each other." Dot smiled, settling into the familiar rhythm of a story she'd told dozens of times to children at the hospital, reporters, and anyone else who wanted to understand how a 72-year-old widow and a traumatized German shepherd had saved each other. "Well, sweetheart, it started with a storm," she began, her voice carrying the practiced cadence of her teaching days. Not just the rain and wind kind, but the kind of storm that happens in people's hearts when they've forgotten how to hope. As she spoke, Atlas moved closer to Emma, allowing the little girl to lean against his side while she listened. The sight of them together, the gentle giant who'd survived hell and the special needs child who'd never quite fit in anywhere else, captured everything beautiful about unexpected friendships and unconditional love. Tommy watched his mother tell their story and marveled at the changes in her. The frightened, isolated woman who'd hidden her heart condition and talked to photographs had been replaced by someone vibrant and purposeful. Atlas had given her a reason to fight, but more than that, he'd reminded her that love multiplies rather than divides when it's shared generously. "The most important thing to remember," Dot concluded, "is that Atlas was never really dangerous. He was just broken and scared, which sometimes looks the same from the outside. The real danger was in people's hearts, the fear and hatred that makes us willing to destroy beautiful things rather than take the time to understand them." As the afternoon sun began to sink toward the horizon, painting the park in shades of gold and amber that matched Atlas's eyes, families began packing up their picnic supplies and heading home. But the Whitman family lingered, reluctant to end what had become a perfect day. "You know what Harold would say if he could see us now?" Dot asked, addressing both Tommy and Atlas with equal affection. "What's that, Mom?" "He'd say we look like family. Not perfect, maybe, but real. The kind of family that shows up for each other when it matters." She scratched Atlas behind his ears, a gesture that never failed to make his tail wag. And he'd probably add that Atlas deserves the first burger at next week's barbecue. Tommy laughed, remembering countless summer evenings when his father had insisted on feeding every stray animal in the neighborhood before the family sat down to eat. "Some traditions are worth keeping," he agreed. As they walked home through the quiet streets of Millbrook, Atlas trotting contentedly between Dot and Tommy, they passed the house where Marcus Webb had once lived. It sat empty now, a for sale sign marking the end of one story and the potential beginning of another. The town had learned hard lessons about the danger of unchecked authority and the importance of listening to inconvenient truths. But those lessons had also revealed something beautiful about human nature, the capacity for growth, forgiveness, and second chances. Millbrook was a better place now, more compassionate and more willing to look beyond surface appearances to find the truth underneath. That evening, as Dot prepared for bed in the house that no longer felt too large or too quiet, she found Atlas waiting in his usual spot beside Harold's reading chair. The big dog had claimed that corner of the living room as his own, perhaps sensing that it still held echoes of the man who'd understood the importance of protecting lost and broken things. "Good night, sweetheart," Dot whispered, giving Atlas his final pat of the day. "Sweet dreams." Atlas settled onto his bed with a contented sigh, but his ears remained alert, listening for any sound that might indicate his family needed him. Old habits from his service days died hard, but now his protective instincts were focused on love rather than survival. In the months ahead, there would be therapy sessions to attend, children to comfort at the hospital, and countless small acts of service that proved every day that redemption was real and second chances were sacred. But tonight, in a house filled with love and laughter and the gentle sounds of a family at peace, Atlas was exactly where he belonged. The boy who'd been called a monster had become what he'd always been in his heart, a guardian angel with 4 legs and an unlimited capacity for forgiveness. And sometimes that's exactly the kind of miracle the world needs most. For our listeners aged 55-68, Atlas's story reminds us that it's never too late for second chances, whether we're offering them or receiving them. Like Dot, many of us have hidden our struggles to maintain independence, fearing that asking for help means admitting defeat. But Atlas teaches us that vulnerability and strength often wear the same face, and that the most profound connections happen when we open our hearts to the broken and beautiful souls around us. In a world that often judges by appearances and dismisses what it doesn't understand, choosing compassion over fear becomes a radical act of love. What Atlas in your life might be waiting for someone to see past the surface? Have you ever discovered that someone you initially feared or misunderstood turned out to be exactly what your heart needed? Share your stories of unexpected friendships and second chances in the comments below. Your experience might be the encouragement someone else needs to take that first brave step toward connection.